If you know me, you know I like to use historical incidents to illustrate homilies and things. So I've chosen another incident from the early history of the church today to begin with. And this was during the persecution under the Romans in the first 3 centuries. The church was periodically persecuted by the state, but probably the worst persecution happened under the Emperor Diocletian. And in 304, there was an incident that happened in the small village of Abatine in what today is Tunisia in North Africa. So there, one Sunday, although the Romans didn't have a 7-day week, but the Christians did, and they knew that it was on Sunday, so Roman soldiers broke into a church house that was being used as a place of the Eucharist. And they arrested 49 Catholics there. And this was the house of one Octavius Felix. So the emperor had forbidden Catholics to gather on Sunday for Mass, on the pain of death. If we catch you, we'll kill you. Well, they caught them and they took them to Carthage, which was the provincial capital. And there they were tried by the governor. And the official documents, record of what the governor questioned the defendants about has survived. And honestly, many of the accounts of the early martyrs, they are legendary or, again, not very historically trustworthy. But this is one of those that historians think this is probably the real thing here. And so the governor asked them why they had defied the emperor's law. And one man named Emeritus had answered, Sine Dominico non possimus, in Latin. That is, without Sunday we cannot live. We cannot live without gathering on the Lord's Day to celebrate the Eucharist. We would lack the strength to face our daily problems and struggles. This wasn't good enough for the emperor's governor, so he condemned them and tortured them and killed all 49, martyrs of the Eucharist. They died because they couldn't not go to the Eucharist. So I think of that incident in terms of what's happening in the gospel today. We have the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 from John 6. This is the beginning of that chapter. So for the next 4 or 5 weeks, we're going to finish up. We're going to go through the entire John 6 chapter. It's a long one, but we're going to have the whole thing. And so I'd like to again, look at this chapter. It's the great foreshadowing of Eucharistic theology. It's interesting. John doesn't actually have an account of the Last Supper where the Eucharist is established. His theology of the Eucharist is here in John 6. And the proclamation that Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats my flesh will live forever. So this week what I want to do, as we spend these weeks looking at the Eucharist, I want to talk about the importance of the Eucharist on Sunday, receiving the Eucharist every Sunday. So Jesus, through his church, and actually also the commandments of the Old Testament, if we look at them the right way, there's a command to celebrate the Eucharist and to keep the Sabbath holy. This is one of the precepts of the church. And it's supposed to be a highlight of our week. And I know our attitudes are all over the place when it comes to coming to Mass, right? But this is realistically, if not emotionally, all the time, the source and summit of our life is coming to the Eucharist on Sunday. The Catholics of Abatine, they knew this. They risked their lives to come together on Sundays for the Eucharist because they found it was necessary for their lives. This is what's going to make me get through. And I wonder, myself, maybe you too, you can think, would I do that? If I knew that I was risking my life to come to Mass, would I bother? I mean, what keeps me from already? And in fact, do we find it necessary to have the Eucharist? I mean, how much did we miss it at COVID, for instance? I mean, again, those thoughts are there. And we have a great privilege of freely celebrating Mass. Nobody stops us. I mean, there are places in the world where the spirit of Diocletian is alive, right? Whether you go to China or Saudi Arabia, whatever. There are places where it's a risk to go to Mass. That's not us. So we have this privilege, but we have a grave obligation to go every week. Every week. This is a serious sin to not keep the Sabbath holy, to miss Sunday Mass. Now, or Saturday. Now, yes, we're sick, okay, sure. I'm working, I can't help it, okay. I'm traveling, I'm on vacation, there's just no Catholic church. Okay, that's possible, out in the middle of nowhere camping or flying 24 hours to Asia or something, sure, there are reasons. And I'd say this, though, hey, you can get a dispensation from me. I'm your pastor. You say, hey, Father, I'm going to miss next week because X, Y, or Z. I say, okay. Now, I'm probably going to ask you to make it up by going to a daily Mass. Sometimes people go, oh, I have to make it up. Just a daily Mass. They're shorter. They're only half hour long. Now, bad reasons that I wouldn't give you dispensation for is I want to sleep in. I'd say, well, no. I want to go fishing, like next door. I will have company over. It's a great witness. You have company over and say, hey, enjoy yourself. Here's the breakfast. We'll be back in an hour. You might think, well, that's rude. No, it's witnessing. This is what's important to us. Anyway, you get that. So in this precept of the church, the commandment, it's not an authoritarian move, trying to control you or induce guilt. It's Holy Mother Church, the mother her children. She knows what's good for us. Without this, how do we get through? So I regularly speak to older parents and about their adult children who no longer practice the faith. And they often wish they could go back in time and have another chance to raise their kids with the knowledge and faith that they now possess, but they didn't back in their 40s. They wish they had another shot. They wish they could emphasize the faith more than they once did. Again, what are we saying, especially like to our children or something, but in general, about Jesus, about the church, about the Eucharist, if all of those come somewhere down in the middle of our priorities? Sometimes we go, sometimes we don't. I mean, again, think of the martyrs of Aberdeen, the Eucharistic martyrs there. Can you really believe in, much less die for, a God, a sacrament that seems less important than fishing or select soccer or something? I mean, and more important, will your kids, because they soak in by example what you do and what I do. They learn they observe, they're very observant. And they just know what's important to us. They may agree or they may not agree, but at least they know what's important by our actions. And I know it's a struggle to come to Mass every week. That's hard. Let alone bringing your kids to Mass. That's sometimes harder. Requires faith, requires perseverance, patience, humility, all of those things. The commitment to go to every Mass every weekend, rather than just sometimes, this is a huge spiritual leap. It's a conversion. I always think, sometimes people think conversion is a one-time thing where either I don't believe or I believe. Well, that's big. But then there are different stages on the spiritual life. And it's a big step from going to never to sometimes. That's huge. But then there's an equally large step, a second conversion, saying, it's not just I'm going to go sometimes when it works out. I'm just going to go always. This is my commitment. I'm committing to it. Huge. Now, by faithfully honoring Eucharist every Sunday, it's just showing how important it is to our lives. It's not a promise that your kids are never going to wander away. They have their own journey. They have their own, they have the free will. But what you do is you give them the grace, the memories, the experience, and the knowledge that they can say, okay, I know the church and it's a spiritual home if I want to come back. That was my experience. Remember, I was an atheist for a while. I left the church. I was raised every single Sunday we went to Mass. I'm kind of surprised. We never got out of it. And I then left because it wasn't my thing for years. But I knew where to come back. When I had this sort of reversion experience and I started asking questions and I started learning and I started feeling God's grace, I knew where to sneak back into the back of the Catholic Church. This past week, there was a huge convention, a revival, really, the National Eucharistic Congress back in Indianapolis. Lots of speakers, lots of prayer, it's beautiful. And one of the great speakers there, he's kind of one of these media priests, Father Mike Schmitz, said, I'm paraphrasing this, but he said basically, we've heard a lot about the growing percentage of Catholics who don't believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. He said, but, deep down, the problem really is not a head thing. It's not knowledge, whether I know about that or not. It's a heart thing, which is, I don't know if I care. Again, it's not so much that it's a disbelief. It's not ignorance, it's more indifference. And that means, he says, we need to change our heart. That's what conversion is. It's a repentance. It's saying, I'm turning it around. So, come to think about it, it's not just China or Saudi Arabia where we find pressure on the faith these days. The place, like the Roman soldiers aren't coming to our door, probably. But there are pressures and there are obstacles. And I'm convinced in this society, as it goes in that direction, increasingly there's going to be this huge fork in the road. There's not going to be a sometimes Catholic go to Mass. It's going to be, I'm always going, or I'm not bothering. That's where it's starting to shake out. Half measures, Mass once, twice a month. Again, that's level 1 conversion. It won't last eventually. Mass on only some Sundays, eventually comes on a few, then rarely, Christmas and Easter, never. Sunday observance is a challenge to our society because it's a commitment. It's a thing of obedience. We don't even like to think of that word. It's self-sacrifice. And it's a recognition that this Eucharist is not just about me, it's about my family, it's about God. It's bigger than me. And it needs to be part of my life. So, again, sine Dominico non possumus. Without Sunday, we cannot live. So said the Catholics under the Roman persecution. So without the Eucharist, without being fed by the bread of life, without having the word proclaimed week in, and out, they said, how will we find the strength to face our daily problems and struggles? It's our question too. Why not seek the help of Christ in the Eucharist? How else can we remain faithful to God when the world itself is increasingly unfaithful?